Okay, I'm going to get us started. My name is Gal Patashnik. I am the communications person and the person supporting this webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so pleased to be hosting the final session of the Common Good webinar with Colin Rogers and Helene Perold. I am going to make this very quick because usually Wendy Osborne is the one doing this introduction, so I'm going to pass it straight to Helene. Thank you all so much for coming, and we really look forward to this wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much, Gal, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this very, very important and I think quite different discussion from what we've had before. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this webinar today. And thank you, Colin, for making yourself available to share your experience and help us learn more about this very important area. We were just saying that the world is not in a happy place. A lot of conflict going on, and the issue of humanitarian aid and disaster with climate change very much upon us is really top of mind. So very quickly, I just want to introduce Colin, whose professional experience spans over 20 years of work experience in civil society and academia and consulting in different parts of the world, including Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. And his research interests are centered on power, civic agency, volunteerism, and philanthropy. And I think from my point of view, there's a lot of overlap and synergy between the issues that I'm very interested in looking at as well. So Colin, welcome, and over to you. Oh, and before I start, sorry, if I could just say one more thing. Gal kindly shared with us yesterday the registrations that had been made up until yesterday. And I just thought it might be interesting for you to know, as participants, that there were 8 academic individuals from academic institutions who signed up, 7 from governments, 9 corporates, and about 44, 45 nonprofits. And I think that tells us something about the relevance of this topic to different sectors in the world that we're working in. Thank you, Colin. That's it from my side.
Many thanks, Helene, and hello, and great to see everybody on today's call, and thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to today's discussions. And what we'll be doing is looking at the humanitarian sector and the role of skilled and specialist volunteers. If we could move to the next slide, please, Gal. So I've been working in the humanitarian sector for close to 30 years, which always scares me when I realize how long I've been in the sector. And I've worked across a number of different countries, from Southeast Asia all the way across to South America. I've worked on the front line, leading humanitarian responses, as well as at a global strategic level. I've worked in a range of different crises, from rapid onset disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, cyclones, to refugee crises, to conflict and disease outbreaks. And I've got a background in tropical parasitology, the diagnosis and treatment of parasitic diseases, and a master's in post-war reconstruction studies. Next slide, please. So I've recently joined MapAction only 1 month ago, so new into the job. And really, this is the first time I've been working for an organization that really focuses on volunteers. And MapAction was established in the early 2000s, and we provide support in geospatial mapping and data analysis in the humanitarian sector, ensuring that decision makers have access to critical information and analysis to support their decision making. And just for those of you that don't know what geospatial information is basically the link between geography and mapping in its simplest form, looking at location information, data that's tied to and portrayed on a map. Next slide, please. And so looking at the SDGs, and SDG 13 on climate action has a really close link with humanitarian action, as you can see there on the slide. At the moment, humanitarian needs are at an all-time high. We're seeing increased severity, duration, and increased numbers impacted. This year alone, there are 363 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian sector is targeting 248 million of those with assistance. And the funding required, again, at an all-time high, is $55.5 billion US. But as we draw to the end of the year, only 32% of those funds have been secured. And that is quite a significant shortfall in the funding requirements. And what we know is that disasters have a significant negative impact on the SDGs. The SDGs are not all moving forwards as we would like to see them. And this is why it's really important for me that we focus on humanitarian response, because it has such a link with all the SDGs. And if we're not focusing on humanitarian response and the impacts of crises, then that sustainable development, the goals, the successes that have been achieved will be eroded. But with this scale of humanitarian need globally, there really is a need for concerted effort across a range of different stakeholders, not just the traditional actors of the UN, international non-governmental organizations, and local NGOs, but really recognizing that the scale of need surpasses the capacity of the sector. And we need to bring in a much more diversified range of stakeholders to support. And this is where the role of volunteers, and in particular volunteers from the private sector, is critical. But what we need to recognize is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach as to what volunteering looks like. Employers and employees need a basket of options that suit their company capability and their staff availabilities. From the MapAction perspective, we are very much looking at specialist volunteers that have a specific technical background, but we shouldn't overlook the role that volunteers could bring in terms of human resources, marketing, comms, legal skill sets, all core skills that the charity sector really needs in order to conduct its business. But it's also important for me that volunteering is looked at as a strategic partnership, and it's critical, particularly in humanitarian response, that we're not looking at a one-off approach to this. At the same time, we've got to make sure that any volunteering approaches strengthen the humanitarian sector and support us getting much needed humanitarian assistance to those most at risk. But at the same time, we've got to recognize that working through a volunteer approach does come with costs. At times when I'm in discussions, it seems that there's a perception that volunteering is cost neutral. It's not. And so hopefully, as we have those discussions with the private sector on corporate volunteering support, that there can be a recognition that to accompany any volunteering, there is a need for some sort of cash donation as well. And why is that needed? Well, if I look at it from the perspective of MapAction, our volunteers will deploy with laptops. So they need to have a laptop with all of the software that is needed for that deployment. We need to do training, vaccinations, deployment kits, pre and post deployment support, and that all comes with a cost. And I think when we're talking about volunteering, quite often those costs can be overlooked. Next slide, please. So good data saves lives in emergencies. And with, as I spoke about earlier, with limited financial resources, but increasing humanitarian need, the role of data in supporting humanitarian response and supporting the achievements of SDG 13 is critical. And this is where volunteers with specific technical skill sets have a role to play. In every crisis or hazard, people making decisions about aid and targeting of that aid, as well as search and rescue teams, need to understand what's happening. They need to understand what data is telling them. Strong geospatial and data analysis provides those decision makers with the critical information that they need when they need it to make sure that those individuals at most risk receive the assistance they need when they need it. That data provides disaster response organizations the ability to navigate any disaster situation and to allocate aid where it's needed most. Next slide, please. So who are MapAction's volunteers? So we've got a cohort of 70 skilled volunteer mappers, specialists in geographic information systems, data analysts, and they've responded to more than 140 emergencies over the last 20 years. They're primarily Europe-based, but we're really challenging ourselves on how do we diversify our volunteer pool and how do we capitalize on a global pool of skilled professionals? And no doubt this will come up in the Q&A at the end, but it is something that we are really looking at the moment and thinking through how do we adapt to the evolving humanitarian system and what's happening there. These volunteers have delivered nearly 500 professional developments to more than 2,400 people in 112 countries. They're providing disaster resilience tools and services to more than a dozen global partners, including UN agencies, local disaster management authorities. But it's not all about emergency response, and our volunteers are increasingly looking at the preparedness, early warning, early action, really thinking through anticipatory action as well. And this is quite a key area of development within the humanitarian sector. So really helping to mitigate the impact of future crises on populations. And this is where we see we really have a key role to play there as well. What we see also is that our volunteers are deploying quickly to emergency through deployment with the UNDAC system, the UN Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team, providing that support to the UN system, providing remote mapping support, and developing tools and training models to strengthen the sector. So next slide, please. So the humanitarian volunteers, a sustainable volunteer model. It's not as simple as signing up and then deploying into a crisis. Volunteering is a professional sector in itself. What we see is that our volunteers are coming from leading tech and private sector companies, as well as government agencies. And in order to equip them to deploy into humanitarian crises, we provide training that takes place all year round. This provides them the skills and the knowledge that they will need to deploy into breaking humanitarian crises. It also means that we take clearly our duty of care towards those volunteers. Deploying into a humanitarian crisis is not very easy, and you're confronted with a scale of suffering that most people will not have seen before. So we really take it as a core part of our approach to volunteering. And so these volunteers have to undergo a rigorous selection and induction process, and they must fulfill a certain threshold of training before they can deploy into a crisis. Our partners, the UN, regional disaster management authorities, have an expectation that volunteers bring in an additional level of skill sets to that response. So what I think hasn't been recognized in the humanitarian sector is that technical and specialist volunteers have a critical role to play. And they are really at the heart of humanitarian response, providing support and data analytics to a broad range of humanitarian stakeholders. And we started as a small organization, but over the last 20 years have really grown our offer of service to the sector, so much so that at the moment, it is difficult to keep up with the demand that comes in. Next slide, please. And so here's a photograph of some of our volunteers who were at a week-long training exercise last year as part of that being prepared and ready to deploy into a crisis. And these volunteers include GIS, Geographical Information System specialists, academics, data scientists, colleagues who work for government agencies, coming from a range of disciplines with job titles such as Head of Artificial Intelligence, Senior Scientist, Flood Modeler, or Director of Community Renewal Development. Coming from a broad range of employers, including the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the British Geographic Society, Ordnance Survey, and the British Antarctic Society. So really, we're bringing in a huge diverse range of skill sets that play a critical role in strengthening the overall humanitarian response to crises and supporting countries to be prepared for the next crisis, to reduce the impact and to ensure that civil society is better equipped for the next crisis that will come along. But maybe I'll pause there for now. The next slide gives you the links to our web pages, our Twitter feed, our LinkedIn, and my contact details in case you would like to reach out and have a further discussion. But Helene, maybe I will pause there and open that up for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Just fascinating and such a wide-ranging set of issues that you are dealing with in a very turbulent world that we're living in. If I could just pick up on a few points that you raised. I'm interested in how MapAction operationalizes its humanitarian operations. So you're based in the UK. I'm assuming that most of your skilled volunteers are in the UK, but I could be wrong. That would be interesting to know. As I said at the beginning, we do have some company representatives on, hopefully still, well, they registered, whether they're here or not, I'm not sure. But there are serious implications, I believe, for business in respect of corporate social responsibility. Both implications, opportunities, challenges. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about the operationalizing of the work and how do those volunteers function and when?
Absolutely, indeed. No, it's a great question. Thank you, Helene. And yes, most of our volunteers are from Europe at the moment. And this is something that we are discussing on how do we diversify that into a global pool of volunteers coming from all corners of the globe. So again, that they are closer to the point of impact of crises. And recognizing there are specific centers of excellence globally where you can find a really developed skill set in terms of geospatial and data analytics. I'm thinking particularly Southeast Asia, for instance, or South America. And so we are having that discussion internally as to how can we adapt and evolve our model for operations. So it isn't Europeans traveling to disasters, but that we are a catalyst for growing that capability at a country or sub-regional level. So our volunteers all have day jobs. They've all got very time-consuming day jobs, and they have an agreement with their employers. And so when that request comes from the UN to deploy, then a number of our volunteers request annual leave and use that annual leave to deploy into the front line of a disaster. that to me is pretty amazing and really shows a strong commitment to the theme of these discussions, the common good, wanting to utilize their skills and their experience to support others. Now, we don't run country operations ourselves. We have no plans to set up country operations under a MapAction country office. Our role is to strengthen the existing structures. So that's where we deploy into the UN, for instance. So we will deploy there into the coordination centers in a humanitarian response and provide that additional capability. But again, that's where it challenges our model a little bit to think through, well, actually, looking at language, looking at understanding context, being able to deploy people from within that sub-region or from within that country would be really good. So then we are going to have a discussion around the different types of skill sets we need and the roles of different parts of the organization. What that looks like at the moment, I don't know. We have to have that debate, and I hope to see some thoughts or suggestions from colleagues on this call as to what could that look like, or pointing me in the direction of models that we could explore. But hopefully that answers your question on operationalizing there.
Thank you. That certainly helps. So am I correct in understanding that at the moment you have your main, if for want of a better expression, conduit of deployment is really through the UN, which you were saying was the Center for the Disaster Assessment and Coordination team. And I would imagine that that makes a lot of sense. And how is your organization funded?
No, indeed. I think we do a lot of deployment with the UN UNDAC team, but at the moment also we are spending a lot of time working with regional disaster management authorities. So over the last month, we've had a series of specialists working with the Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Management Authority and really strengthening skill sets around geospatial. I probably do need to promise SDGs, the Caribbean Disaster and Emergencies Management Authority, because each time the team arrived in a new country, they were followed shortly afterwards by a hurricane or a tropical storm. So I may need to make some apologies. There is no tying up. It is that time of year, unfortunately, but really demonstrated there to the different host governments the importance of geospatial data and mapping as they were looking at the movements of the storms and populations that could be impacted, for instance. Our funding comes from a variety of places, and at the moment we have governmental funding from institutional donors. We receive funding from UN agencies, and again we also have private trusts, foundations, philanthropic giving, etc. So a range of donors coming in there. But when you're a volunteer focused organization, you need a different level of unrestricted funding that gives you a level of flexibility, and institutional donor funding doesn't always give you that. And so really thinking through how to access unrestricted funding is a key thing that we will be looking at over the coming weeks and months.
I can imagine that's quite challenging because you don't seem to have, I assume you have strong partnerships, but possibly not a dependable, reliable stream of funding that, as you were saying, there's a shortfall globally. Yeah. And I imagine, I could be wrong, but northern governments in some respects are also deploying funding into managing the refugee migration processes and you know, taking care of the fallout from the wars that are going on both in my region in Africa and obviously in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So yeah, that is interesting. When you talk about partnerships, you talked about needing strategic partnerships, Colin. What might those look like, and who would some of the partners be?
No, indeed. I think probably diverse. Looking at the business functions that we have, partnerships that can support different areas. So part of that might be corporates releasing volunteers who are able to deploy into a crisis, and hopefully supporting the costs associated with that: laptops, vaccinations, trainings, security training, first aid kits, etc. But also recognizing the need for support on maybe legal or human resources, the pre-deployment briefing and debriefing for volunteers that are going into crises, and how to support them with the psychosocial support of having worked in a rapid onset, large-scale humanitarian crisis. But at the same time, looking at gifts in kind, so for instance, linking up with the technology sector and licenses for the software that might be needed, or recognizing the type of laptops that would be required to do this data analysis and mapping. So to ensure that volunteers have access to high quality laptops that are robust enough for working in a rapid onset disaster and pretty challenging situations. So really being open to that broad range of partnerships and understanding different corporates would have different interests. How can you capitalize on their skill sets and what they do in their day-to-day business, that it brings in an added value for an organization such as MapAction as well? And so really to have that open discussion with them on what they can provide, what is needed, because at times that can be quite a complex partnership to manage over time, and managing expectations on that as well. It's not that we would be looking to take corporate partners on a field visit to see what a humanitarian crisis looks like on the ground. And over the course of my career from the last 30 years, there's been times when people have asked to go on a fact-finding visit to the front line, and that's really not appropriate to be doing. So really managing expectations, ensuring that it's supporting the organization effectively and contributing to the common good as well, and recognizing the humanitarian principles, so always aligning with those humanitarian principles: independence, neutrality, impartiality, on the basis of need. And that for me is really a key starting point for those discussions, to understand our ways of working and the values that underpin the humanitarian sector.
So you mentioned, and this is a good segues, you mentioned that MapAction started as a small organization and has grown, and there's a lot of demand. Laurie Foster was asking, do you have a person on your team that coordinates corporate volunteers? For example, if a company wants to work with you to send long-term volunteers, whom should they contact?
Absolutely, we do indeed. I think maybe as a starting point, they could contact with myself, and then we can pick up that discussion and see what their thinking is. And then we can link up with key colleagues on the team. But Laurie, I can send you some of those contacts. I'm more than happy to catch up with you outside of this call. It's been a little while since we caught up last year in Abu Dhabi, and as you noticed this year, I actually have my voice back again, so that's quite nice. But absolutely, and this is really important on relationship management, and also giving recognition to corporates that do release their staff to go at short notice, because this does have a negative impact on the team that they're released from. It adds work pressure and workload there. So I'm very mindful to go back to our corporate partners to say thank you, to update them on what their staff have done, and really ensure they understand the positive value that that has had. And we've just done that for volunteers that have returned from supporting the Libya response and going back to their employers to say thank you. This is what they did, and this was the value of that.
So I think that does partly answer Andrew Bray's question, which is what are the enablers and challenges with MapAction balancing corporate needs, donors and employers, and the common pool resources, volunteer and humanitarian needs. I mean, you've touched on that. Is there more to say?
I think a recognition, as I was saying earlier, that volunteering carries a cost. It's not that you're providing free staffing, free volunteer support, etc. There is a cost to manage that. There is a cost to provide the trainings, the inductions, the equipment, etc. And really being able to have that open discussion, say, it is great that you would like to make your staff available, but actually these are the costs associated with that. And without the provision of a cash donation, we will then be taking funds from other sources that would hopefully have been better focused on developing tools for anticipatory action or supporting a training for local actors on this instead. So we would much rather that our tight resources are focused on the point of impact, and that those strategic partnerships provide us a level of flexible resources in addition. And we're not talking huge amounts either. And some of that could be goods in kind. So for instance, if you're a tech company, donating 20, 30 laptops probably isn't going to make a big dent in the bottom line for them. So really capitalizing on their skill sets, but us giving recognition there as well. And maybe as a sector, we might need to be better at doing that as well.
Mm. And Colin, I think that, you know, from my point of view, and you and I chatted a little bit about this, the big question is, as you mentioned at the beginning, the challenge of unlocking the ability of in-country volunteers, be they community-based or professionals of various kinds, to contribute to the geospatial mechanisms that may be required for data collection and the language facility, the cultural issues. I mean, you know, when we've looked at the crises with floods in Pakistan and the fires in Australia and in California and elsewhere, mudslides, and you don't have I assume one doesn't have time to do much in the sense of suddenly recruiting volunteers or briefing or whatever. One's got to be ready to go. But if one wanted to move in the direction, one thought that you've suggested to me is that if companies in affected countries would be willing to get in touch with you and start exploring ways in which, as you've said, you know, if Safaricom in Kenya were able to make some laptops available, or Accenture work with its volunteer program, employee volunteer program to do skills development. There's also the question of, as you said, locating those geographic nodes to source partnerships with specialists in different parts of the world. And Megan Suslak was asking whether you'd partnered with associations of global mapping tech providers. And also, besides government agencies, have you utilized other on-the-ground agencies for onboarding and training?
Good question there, Megan. And I'll preface this by saying I'm only 4 weeks into the role, so I might not know all the answers to that. So partnering with associations of global mapping tech providers. I'm not sure, that hasn't come up in my reading, etc. So I will go away and have a look at that. And if we haven't, we'll see how we could engage there. And government agencies, we have been involved with a number of government agencies, primarily on building professional development in geospatial. And we've just done a lot of training there. And I really see that as a key priority for us going forwards, ensuring that regional disaster management authorities are better equipped to coordinate, lead humanitarian response, to anticipate future crises. And I was reflecting on this and thinking back through the last 30 years of my career. And unfortunately, in many of those crises, the national or regional disaster management authorities weren't very visible. They tend to be underfunded, their importance not necessarily recognized effectively. And I think there really is a role for us as MapAction to be looking at how can we strengthen that. And we've been working with a number of agencies for the last few years, and something we want to continue building, strengthening. So actually, those regional disaster management authorities can deploy their own staff into those crises and are able to lead and coordinate and do what MapAction has been doing. That would be the ideal end game, to see the Caribbean or ASEAN centers really taking that lead and having those staff that they can do it. So how can we work with them to build that capability, but also work with them to help ensure that there are funding streams coming through to enable that work to take place? So yeah, a bit more work to do there, Megan, on that. But I see there's also another question came through on Gaza and Israel.
Yes.
Really tricky situation at the moment, as probably everybody on this call knows. So humanitarian access into Gaza is extremely difficult at the moment. We have been contacted by 2 UN agencies, and our teams are on standby to support as and when humanitarian assistance is better able to step up, to scale up, and to meet those needs. So it is something we are waiting to be able to get people deployed. And we've had people on standby now since the start of the crisis and the first alert from the UN for their standby partners to be looking at this. But yeah, a very worrying situation, and we're not operational. We're really there to provide a service to a range of different stakeholders. And so we will continue those discussions and see how can we have that value add to really ensure that humanitarian assistance gets to where it's needed.
I just wanted to go back to Megan's question, because I don't really understand what associations of global mapping tech providers are. Megan, do you want to join the discussion and switch on your mic? Gal, can she do that?
Yes, if Megan is comfortable doing that, I can allow her to speak.
Yeah, Megan, would you like to just help us understand this a little bit better? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
And I don't know if I said the correct phrasing, but I have a friend who her master's is in like geo mapping. Like, for example, her company has helped, like if you go through the Atlanta airport and you do like interactive 3D like web maps that take you like, you know, from terminal to terminal. And she's part of an association of professionals that do this type of thing. So like right now I work for a different association, so that might be an area where if you get connected at an association level, a lot of your large multinational or national based companies, a lot of their paid staff and their members are, you know, probably folks I would imagine that would have similar skill sets to what you need. And that might be a way to map, to get connected in other parts outside of Europe that you may not, you know, have a single point of entry for multiple potential partners.
Do you know of any such points of entry in the Global South, for example?
It depends on the association. There might be companies that, you know, have a presence in the Global North and the Global South. That's why an association can sometimes be a good place to start, because, you know, you may have a company that has it's just a mapping company, or they may have, you know, say an Accenture type that has multiple facets. So they may not have a direct presence in this field, but you may have a company that's physically in the Global North that has partners or their own, you know, divisions in the Global South. So that was just the idea. It was just when he said he was trying to breach further out of Europe, this might be a place that it could give you to start for those relationship building.
Megan,
Awesome.
you're really correct there, because what we've seen in the past is that employees in companies in disaster affected countries are pushing their management as to what is that company going to do in response to a crisis, and that employees are often driving this narrative as well in terms of corporate social responsibility as to what is happening in their communities, in other parts of their country, etc. And I think it's a really good point that you raised there on those global networks and multinationals have a real reach right down into grassroots level, and gives you huge access to such a diverse range of different stakeholder groups that me sitting in my living room in London would not have the same access to. And so I think that's a grouping I will be picking up on after this. And any of my colleagues from MapAction on the call, please jot down the name of that organization so we can pick up this discussion over the course of the coming days.
Great. And then, Colin, we have a question from another participant who thanks you and says you've emphasized the importance of recognizing volunteers. What recognition tactics have worked for MapAction, and how did it impact your volunteer pool?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's something that we're really working on at the moment, and something we are looking at is an annual report. When I say report, I mean very light touch. Some examples of what volunteers have done on deployments, and really calling out each volunteer and what they've done, and giving recognition back to the employer. So again, that can be shared either with their board of trustees, their board of directors, or with their staff as well. At the moment, we have one of our volunteers has done a blog for his company webpage and their company LinkedIn, you know, really calling out the support that their employer has provided. So that's another way. But I do think it's something we really have to step up and strengthen, because there's only so much time that goodwill will last before you really start giving clear thank yous, demonstrating that simple things, recognition on your webpage or on your social media feed, and tagging the employer of a volunteer that is deploying out to the latest crisis, etc. But also the opportunity for some of those employers who are interested to have a volunteer or myself or another member of my team come and talk about humanitarian response and what we're doing, and to do a lunchtime open access talk for the staff there and really take those questions, because I think there is a huge interest in humanitarian action. Everybody watches the news, sees what's happening, and everybody is shocked every time there's a new disaster, and they want to understand what's happening on the ground and to understand what one of their colleagues does when they deploy. I think really demonstrates how that company is supporting humanitarian response. So a few things to do. And if anyone's got any best practice, please put it in the chat. I'm more than happy to learn and adapt and take that forward. So we really do strengthen that. But great question.
I mean, Colin, what strikes me listening to you and responding to the questions that are coming up is that there's a lot of, and I think this webinar is a case in point, that there's a lot of room and need for education about this. So there's the technical side, but as you've emphasized a number of times, there are other skill sets that are complementary and will play a big role. But, you know, doing work on the legal side, as you mentioned earlier, the human resources, the marketing, much of that would be ahead of a disaster. Yeah. But it's all about laying the groundwork, and I would think that there would be real appetite or possibility of recruiting those kinds of skills in countries that may be most vulnerable to climate change disaster, for example. I'm thinking of, you know, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Rim, and so on, and even, you know, right around the world. I just wanted to pick up on a point that Ola made, which is that, Ola, you said institutes are always a great place to start dialogue on volunteering opportunities. Gal, Ola, would you be willing to tell us a bit more about what's behind your point, or in what way, what kinds of institutes, and how might one start those dialogues about volunteering opportunities in this field?
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Ola.
I'm Ola Desmond. I'm a business analyst for MapAction, and hi, Colin. I just started really recently too. Hi. I didn't expect to be participating today, so I feel like I'm thrown right in the deep end right now. But yeah, on institutes, personally, I found it an amazing experience because I've come across so many professionals that are keen to develop their skills in any way, and sometimes, you know, they don't always have the possibility to do that within their organization, and the institute directors are very keen to facilitate those opportunities as well. So I think always, you know, worth contacting the institutes and having conversations with the directors. Excuse me, I have a terrible cold. My voice is going.
So, Ola, sorry, pardon my ignorance. Institutes of what kind? And where are we talking about in the world at the moment? Where are they located?
Well, from my standpoint as a business analyst, I'm a member of the International Institute of Business Analysts, which have a worldwide presence. You know, I'm affiliated with the UK chapter, and you know, the same could be said for BCS, which is the UK Institute for Computing. Oh, I've got that wrong now. But yes, you know, they're always good places to start, because you're going to find a massive pool of professionals in there who are keen to, you know, stretch themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. Absolutely. So it's a little bit like we were talking earlier about Megan's point about associations, professional associations, and what you've got here sound like, I don't know whether they can be called regulatory bodies, but again, bodies which are active in mobilizing standards and developing the professional entities that they are representing. So I think that's very, very useful. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for contributing that.
Helen,
and then, yeah,
that sort of really opens up the question there on how to utilize those networks to really ensure a flourishing, diverse range of volunteers. In the humanitarian sector, I think in times previously, emergency response really seen as male dominated, but actually when we look at it now, increasingly more women coming into that. But how can we go out and bring in that diversity? And again, I'd say an underrepresented grouping in volunteers and humanitarian would be individuals with a disability. So how can we bring in that real range and wealth of experience that people bring in and capitalize on that as well? So for me, that's key questions that I'm grappling with. So if you look at a photograph of MapAction volunteers today, then in 5 years' time, look at that photograph. I hope that you will see a very different look for that. And so really, for me, this is the challenge that I'm really thinking through at the moment, on bringing in the wealth of experience that exists out there and doing that for the common good and having that positive impact on individuals affected by crises or at risk from crises.
Great. Thank you so much, Colin, and thanks to everyone. We're reaching, Ralph, you were going to say something about HOT's transition from global to regional humanitarian activations. Can you tell us quickly what you had in mind?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Yes, HOT had this similar problem that Colin is facing. We were very fortunate in that we managed to get a very good injection of funds from the Audacious program. And this allowed us to open up regional hubs on continents. Africa, we have 2 hubs. Asia, we have 1. And Latin America, Caribbean, we have 1 hub. And this is reaching down, so that we're getting away from just the English-based volunteers to the local-based languages and volunteers and cultures. Our mapping activities are global. There's only 4 major commercial map makers in the world, online map makers in the world, and HOT, of course, has challenged them quite heavily as a volunteer base. Now, Colin will know that MapAction uses OpenStreetMap considerably. But we have also managed to get down to the regional level, because we can only supply you with the detailed information from local people. We cannot do it from our global armchair mappers. And this is what we have done, gone down to global level. I would suggest that's something that they should be looking at, is more local people set up, ready to move. An ideal is the Syria Turkey earthquake, where we had a local group actually coordinate all our mapping, and it moved a lot better because they would be able to communicate in their own language with the various players in the field and come back to us and assist us that way. This has also been very good in terms of you raising the recognition thing. And we found out that recognition of mappers and validators and their skills is very, very important. And it's definitely a good way to go. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Very helpful. Colin, do you want to respond?
Totally agree, and so good to hear the positive change that brought as well, and the enhanced impact. So hopefully, Ralph, we can catch up, and I know I'm looking to get some time with your colleagues, so really looking forward to talking with yourselves over the coming weeks as I get through my induction period and get up to speed on all things humanitarian mapping. But really good points, and really happy to hear that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I've learned a ton from this discussion, and I thank you all for your contributions. Colin, it's been amazing and very, very, it's been eye-opening. And good luck with your vision and your ambition. Look forward to hearing more. And I'd like to pass on to Wendy. Wendy, to close our webinar.
Thank you, Helene. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. I must apologize. I've had some technical difficulties because I couldn't join the webinar from the start. But I'm glad to be able to join it now at the end. And what an interesting discussion it was. On behalf of IAVE, I'd like to thank Colin for his input, and I'd also like to personally congratulate him on his new role. And I'm glad, Colin, yes, when I last spoke to you in person in Abu Dhabi, it was difficult because you did have some problems with a very sore throat. But I'm delighted that today you were able to join us in full voice. And what an interesting discussion it was. And to also thank Helene for being our guest moderator. I've learned a lot too. And I think this final webinar in this series of webinars, The Common Good, Creating a Sustainable Future Through Volunteering, really has highlighted what we wanted to do with this series to show the diversity of volunteering. We started off looking at corporate volunteering in Africa. We moved on to look at leadership for volunteering nationally and regionally in Trinidad and Tobago and throughout the Caribbean. We then started to look at disaster response, and our last webinar focused on that local response and preparedness for disasters. And today now we've had this very important role of specialists and skilled volunteers, and how they're not only involved in humanitarian aid, but are also often involved in many different aspects of volunteering. I know from my own experience in organising events where volunteers are involved, that there were volunteers with health and safety expertise that came on board to help us make those events, for instance, run smoothly. So skills and specialist volunteers are a very important aspect of volunteering. So throughout the 4 webinars, we've touched base on quite a lot. And we'll be continuing to do that as we move forward to the next World Volunteer Conference, which is in Busan in South Korea next October. And I just returned this morning from South Korea, where we had a site visit looking at everything that was going to be involved with our partners in Busan in terms of running a very exciting World Volunteer Conference next year. And some of the things that have come up in these 4 webinars, and particularly in today, will come forward to that conference, because our partners and indeed our network of leaders across volunteering and across the globe continue to have a real focus on things like climate action, and indeed in a response to disasters, and more importantly, I think, and increasingly importantly, preparedness for disasters. And even as I speak to you today, while I've been away, I live in Northern Ireland, and I live close to a small market town, and we've had so much rain that the whole landscape of that market town has returned more or less to a landscape that was seen in a map in the 1700s, because so much rain has created flooding that has not been seen in living memory. So, and I think this year particularly, we've seen quite a lot of difference, and it really shows us that climate change is happening, and that requires us to take climate action. So I'm delighted with the 4 series, and I'm delighted that Gal and I are working on how we can use the series to provide information for the World Volunteer Conference for next year. So when people are looking at our themes and our program, they can tap back into these 4 webinars and build up their knowledge again in relation to the topics that will be under discussion. So I say again, very much thanks to Helene and thanks to Colin. It has been really interesting, and the questions have shown that there's been a real interest in this topic today. And I'm delighted that we've had such a great final webinar for our series. Also thanks to Gal for holding the fort and for helping throughout all the webinars, but particularly helping today whenever I had some technical difficulties. So we've heard a lot today about networking and the importance of networking for all volunteering organisations, and IAVE stands as really that, a global network of for volunteering and for volunteering organisations. And I think these webinars really show that we have that global reach and how important it is for people to connect together, to share and learn and work together in partnership and collaboration, because volunteering and solidarity for volunteering is strengthened when we all do that effectively. So I'd like to thank everyone and all the participants on today's webinar, and thank you very much for joining us.